right, I'm welcoming Jason Stout. I am James Barry for the Kresge Gallery. I'm the gallery director. Jason Stout is at the University of Tennessee in Martin. He's been there for 15 years. His work is now on the show for us. Today's date is 8/19. It's going to be 8/20 when most people are watching this for the first time. So how are you?
I'm doing great, and thanks to James and Lyon College and Dustin and everybody there in Kresge Gallery for allowing me to bring my show Ignition to your beautiful campus. We came down and installed the show and got to walk around, and I was really floored by how beautiful the campus was and the gallery and the historic buildings. And you guys were great hosts while we were there installing the show, and very hospitable to me and my wife. So we just want to thank you guys for just being so great while we were there the other day.
Absolutely. It's an honor to have you. It's really fun meeting you guys too. All right, so we'll get into some of the questions and answering. I'm hoping that tomorrow we'll have the ability to have students ask some questions.
Sure.
I'm sure they'll ask better questions than I do too. So first off, you went from Tennessee for your undergraduate to Texas for your graduate education. Can you talk a little bit about difference in culture, the way you approach that as an artist? Just what was
Sure, and I'll talk about this answer a little bit too with anybody that's there in an undergraduate program looking to apply for graduate school and kind of what you go to. And some of my parts of this story will seem a little dated because they are, but some of them are just as relevant, now as they were then. When I finished up here and I started looking at grad schools to apply to, I wasn't really too bound to places. The only thing that I was nervous about anywhere was driving in a huge city. I mean, I was from a very rural part of Tennessee, and but other than that, I was kind of free to go when I was going to look at a school, and the any of the schools that kind of took me, I was going to kind of weigh them down and go through the process. So I think I applied to 5 or 6 schools, and got into 3 and had decided on one. And one of the schools that I was waiting to hear back from that I hadn't heard back from was University of Texas San Antonio. And there's all kinds of funny things that ended up kind of fate-wise happening that I didn't realize how connected I was to San Antonio until I got there and started studying. So it was definitely the right choice. But at the time, I had decided on another university and was all kind of set mentally to go and was starting the physical preparations of like planning, move, and do all this. And I got a call from who would end up being my graduate school mentor for the next 2.5 years, Connie Lowe, UTSA, letting me know that I was accepted and that they wanted me to come, and they were excited about the possibility of me going there. And I remember the time we heard it on. I was at lunch with my mom. We heard it on an answering machine message, and my mom just looked at me, and she had a very big sense of travel and adventure, and she just said, "Well, that's it. You have to go." And I was like, San Antonio was 14 hours away. I said, I don't know anybody there. And she said, "Well, why did you apply?" And I said, I very basic, 21-year-old things. I like the pictures of their galleries and studios on the website. And I remember being really excited because the new chair of the program at the time was Fran Colpit, who is somebody, I still admire and learned a lot from when I was there. And she had just become the new chair, but she also was a contributing writer for Art in America. And for me, that was kind of just a shot in the dark. Like, I'd love to work with somebody like that. And at the time, the big print publications were the things that you kind of live by. I mean, there was, at the time when I'm doing this, the internet is out and about and we're doing that, but still, like publication, art, print, art form, Art in America, art news, these were still the things that you kind of live by, month to month to see what was new and current. So having a connection to that or the possibility of going to school there was, and being connected to that was a big deal. So we made it happen, and that's where I went. And, there were some great things that happened to me while I was there. Number one, the UTSA program in San Antonio, San Antonio is a beautiful, big little city, which means it's a really big city, but you have the ability in certain parts to make it small. The other thing that was there was it was a great kind of like multicultural experience for me. From being from a rural place, it's exactly what I needed at the time. One of the things I was really excited about, is being a painter, is that there was a huge Chicano painting scene there with people like Alex Rubio and a very young Vincent Valdez at the time. And there were other artists in the community that were kind of comic surreal artists like Regis Shepherd, who's passed on, who taught at St. Mary's College there, and lots of others. And, being able to go there and connect with those artists and, kind of relate to each other stylistically with what I was wanting to do and what they were already doing very successfully, for me was great. And also too, with a lot of the art historians and writers there that, would talk about the political awareness of Chicano art, multiculturalism, all these things that really shaped my kind of knowledge. Because at the time, I was very kind of, I wouldn't say ignorant to those things, but I hadn't been exposed to them enough to have an awareness of seeing how that greater kind of social consciousness could play into your artwork. And so for me, it wasn't just going to a great graduate program, which it was. I got everything and more that I thought I would get out of it. But as a person too, kind of like growing up and developing and not being such a, kind of like a hayseed that I was, coming there from rural West Tennessee, it was a lot of maturity that went on and a lot of stuff that shaped my work that still shapes my work today. So it was a great experience.
Well, it's a good segue. Let's talk about your work. You do have a lot of social commentary, a lot of political stuff. How do you begin a piece? Tell us about your new body, this body of work that you've been working on, and how do you approach a new piece within that body?
Well, the work that I came out of grad school with, and if you want to visit my website, thejasonstout.com, you can go back and see my work in archive kind of block periods. And, a lot of my work was very kind of like, somebody called it hillbilly surrealism one time, but it was very kind of, colorful, figurative, semi-abstraction, but kind of done in a, in what I would call a very traditional way of dealing with, the problem of like Renaissance depth. You build a picture, you have a background, middle ground, foreground, and there's certain ways to build depth with that. And then abstracting the various components at your own kind of will and style. And that's how I was basically building pictures. As I approached the end of 2015, um, one of the problems that I started thinking about with my own work was the limitations of this kind of composition with what was going on socially at the time. We were coming out of uh, an election year and transitioning out of Obama into Trump, and there was a lot of stuff socially that was going on. There was it was about a year and a half, 2 years out of the Trayvon Martin case at the time, which really affected me because I was an expecting father, and so of course the racial components and dynamics were there, but I also looked at it as a father looking at the loss of a son, and it affected me deeply. And but part of the things that was happening is there was so much happening every day with shootings and this transition and political upheaval, and you couldn't keep up. And so doing a standard picture that talked about one narrative or thing, by the time you completed that picture, everybody else had moved on. And really, what the subject of the time was not one specific narrative about one specific event, but the fact that we were being faced with how media had advanced to and developed this accumulation of multiple images, multiple narratives, all hitting us at the same time. And all this stuff was happening at the same time, stacked on top of each other. And it was all happening seemingly over at once. And my real feeling at the time was by the time you were starting to digest one thing, something else was happening. And we were never really able to, or at least I felt completely overwhelmed and never really able to like deal or cope with any of that stuff. So, what I wanted to do compositionally was create a picture construct that would talk about the multiplicity of narratives coexisting to where it touched on each one. And it kind of destroyed that sense of like telling one story in one picture, one place, and one time. And so some of the things that I started to look at the time were things that were kind of the earth, and then things that were kind of like outside of the earth. Because at this time too, I spent a lot of time like looking at the expansion of space pictures and like different things like that that visually for me were exciting, especially like nebulas, which are like space clouds. But I was also spending a lot of time looking at early like 40s and 50s comics. And one of the things that always struck me or stayed with me that I just hadn't tapped into was the idea of like this fight cloud or this dust up where you would have this thing and all these little fragments of figures and parts were kind of coming out of it. And so I thought about kind of using this format or this composition to have parts and pieces of all these kind of narratives and to use objects and things that held symbolic and kind of metaphorical meanings of all these things that were happening. That way I could really produce and create pictures that dealt with the multiplicity of things on the same picture, violence, class, race, politics, class structure, all this stuff. And that's kind of why I switched to that format. And the extent of this show Ignition is really the two phases that I worked on, paintings and drawings. This is a selection of the body of work from the end of 2015 up until 2019, where I just stepped away from a little bit, of trying to explore how to fit multiple narratives in a work in this format. So that's kind of how I got to this point.
Hmm, excellent. Well, you mentioned the comic book, the dust up. So you have very bright, very appealing aesthetics for your paintings. Is that part of where this comes from?
Well, I there's two formal things that were very, I used strong colors before, but it's so much more deliberate in this for a couple of reasons. One, if I can touch on this before I talk about the color, the simplification of like little images and things that seem very simplified. I'm trying in a way to paint objects in these paintings in a way in which it says something, but it says it, and it's not a very complex, realistic language where you have to sit on it. So when you sit on it, it's more like a I would equate it more to like hip hop or something that's very fast moving, that moves really fast. One thing I think you'll notice when you see the paintings is that they all have a very, very quick speed. And part of the formal construct of what it does, and which is great, that kind of like amplifies its speed, is that if you're looking at a traditional Renaissance picture, let's say something that everybody knows, um, I don't know, like the Last Supper or
Mm,
something like that, right?
yeah.
Right. You kind of sit in that picture and it's a window to the world and you're falling into a space. In these pictures with these clouds, the first thing they do is they push you out of the space. And then rather than moving back in and crawling back in, they're actually designed and more of a radial kind of composition to then spin you around. And part of that is very literal. The spin is kind of like the spin of the media, that we don't really know how to disseminate truth anymore. And so when all this stuff is kind of spinning out, you're like taking all this stuff in, you're getting pushed down, it's moving around. It's a very different way of dealing with like traditional depth and making the viewer have a different kind of experience when they're viewing the picture. Uh, Part of that, and what I became aware of when I did this, is that the way in which people talk and communicate with each other had become very different, and I was starting to become aware of that. I teach at a university. I'm the advisor for a student group, and so I'm around 18 to 22-year-olds outside of my class quite a bit, doing service projects and other things. And a student had sent me, was texting me about something one time, and I gave an answer that I don't know if they didn't approve of or they just wouldn't what they wanted to hear. And they sent me back an emoji strand, and it was like 15 things on. And I looked at it, and said, I have no idea what this means, but I was really excited by the sequencing of the image. And this was about the time when I'd started these paintings. And I started thinking about it, and I said, this is really funny because this almost feels like emojis feel like a modern version of hieroglyphics, and that we can assign meaning in things due to the sequence of how these images line up. And so in the pictures, a lot of the stuff you'll see repeated in different ones, but the order is different.
Mm,
And so when you change the order of how, like, painting something or putting a picture in, whether it's a pencil or a bomb or a Confederate hat or a burning flag or a torn up dollar bill, it changes meaning in the sequence of the other pictures that it's surrounded with.
mm,
And so even though some of these paintings will have similar elements, they have very different meanings depending on that sequence. The other thing that I noticed too, and I started thinking about, is just how high saturation everything is. Most people spend time on their phones or on computers, and that stuff doesn't have natural color from the real world. It's artificial high saturation computer graphic color, and advertising does the same thing. And so you're trying to make something visual that's going to at least stand out or have a chance of standing out in this kind of visual world where this is the norm now. I think about when we grew up. I'm not that old. I'm 43, but when I talk about it, it sounds really old. But I remember as a kid, in the country where I lived, we had a television that picked up about three channels, and you had a satellite that, or an antenna that was attached to this thing called a rotor, and you would turn the rotor and you would wait like 4 or 5 minutes for it to get to this channel, and you'd barely get that channel. And then you might have a radio, and there might be a magazine. So really, you had about three types of media, and all of them were slow. And we had dial-up phones that were on the wall. And but I think about what my kids go through when they wake up in the morning. They turn on their TV, they can play music, they're on their phone, and by the time it's 9 o'clock, a day has started, they have been hit with 1,000 images. It might have taken me a week back then to get to 1,000 images growing up. So the multiplicity of information that people are being hit with now, and the loudness of it and the vibrancy of it color wise, I think that the visual language had to reflect that, especially if I'm trying to reflect not only the content of the things that are happening in the modern world with what I'm talking about in socio-political respects, but also too the visual language and the form has to match that too, because that's how we're getting it.
mm.
And so for me, it didn't make sense to paint or do any of this stuff in a very traditional way. And I'm not really, that kind of artist. I do it during painting demos. My painting one class, people were like, "Oh, what a beautiful still life with a glass bottle and an orange." It's just, "Ah, you're good." I was like, "Yeah, but that's not always the language of our time." And so I'm trying to get closer to what I perceive, my opinion is the language of our time. And this is kind of where I got to with doing that.
Well, it creates an interesting dichotomy too. You're pushing people away with the way that they're done and pulling them in with the color choice. That's a cool push and pull effect.
I think most of the things that happen, in American culture, has always been described as being, violent and super, super capitalist at the same time. And it can be dangerous and ugly, but there's also a seduction to the danger of it.
Hmm.
And I just think that that's something we deal with.
Yeah, that does. If I can segue that into, you mentioned that you use Southern culture as sort of a lens of viewing the way you create this work. So how does Southern culture affect your work?
Well, when I was, uh, I think part of what there's two things that I say that work for if you're describing Southern culture now, in a general way that worked then and that still work now. And I would say one that Southern culture is still a very oral tradition. We're storytellers,
Mm.
and you can see that in the poetry. You can see it in music, whether it's country music or whether it's hip hop or anything else. And we do it orally and we do it in pictures. And I always tell people when I meet them after I'm comfortable with them, I like them. I'm like, you got to tell me this, and I'll ask a lot of questions because I'm a collector of stories. And I think that's part of it. The other thing is that you know Southern art, music, food, whatever, is that we're really into flavor. We're into the flavor of things, big flavor. And for me, my flavor comes in my palate. And so those are two basic things. Also too, I'm very aware of the complexities and contradictions of Southern culture. And in my work, I think I deal with the dichotomy of trying to process that, of being what I would consider a somewhat modern forward thinker, uh, both in social rights and activism and the world, but also coming from a culture and upbringing that's not always supportive of that. And trying to find how you navigate in the world, and where you deal with a very complex history of that, and from an oral tradition, but you're also trying to change and build a better history. And I think a lot of my work is about that. It's about that conflict and of trying to figure out our identity through all this, and who we want to be, and where we come from, and then where we're standing at the end of the day. And every day it changes a little bit. So and I think most of the artists in the South, deal with that, that address it and bring it up. And that's what it is. It's a constant kind of dialogue with this contradiction of history, with trying to correct and fix things and make it informed now. And I think that's what we're all trying to do.
Hmm, absolutely. So talking to my students, a lot of them treat art outside of college or outside of the classroom, kind of like talking about life after death. So is there life after college for an artist? Is it something that is viable?
Well, sure. I think the hardest thing, and I'll say this because I want people to appreciate the time that they're in school. Um, the one thing that school really affords you that people take, they just not paying attention to it maybe as much, and then they really see it when it's gone, is that through your instructors and your classmates, you have a creative community. You're paying for classes and instruction and your learning experience, but the best thing about it is you have a creative community. You're around other artists making things that you either like or don't like, but that's both good and bad for you. And you're around professors that really want to teach you and wants you to do well, and they want you to, so to say, carry the fire of the tradition of valuing this thing that they've committed their life to. And I think when people get out of the university setting and they get away from that creative community, and it's not there every day, and they're not forced to interact with it every day for a grade or for approval, it becomes hard to simulate that in the world by yourself. And so when you have to make a living and do that, I don't think that artists are bad necessarily at using their creative work to make a living for themselves. I think most artists struggle with, once they get out of school, finding a way or a means to simulate that creative community that gives them a chance to do that. And so that's really step one. And I think the other thing too is you have to be really honest when you get done, whether it's a BFA or an MFA, of like what you're willing to do and what you're not going to do. Are you willing when you get out, if you're talented enough, to like take tons of commissions and mural work and public work and whatever. And, it's never been a better time right now than to be an artist. I mean, so many people, the artist scene is right now as being small business. In the 90s, it was hard because everything was corporations, right? It was big business and you had to be a big kind of brand or a product to get approval. And I think, that's still the case in some respects in some of your bigger cities and scenes and places. But also, if you're trying to make it in a community where, that's not that. Um, there are people that want to engage artists all the time. One of the things that I serve on and work on is I review grants for the state of Tennessee, both the rural grants and some of the other grants on the other side of the state. And there are so many places now that are creating programming and working with the state, trying to get arts festivals, music festivals, murals in small towns of under 1,000 people, and trying to get money and support artists and do this because they believe it's going to rejuvenate their town and they believe that it's going to revitalize their town. So people are looking at two artists more than ever to revitalize community, and there's plenty of opportunities to do stuff like that. I think if you don't want to teach, there's certain maybe steps that you shouldn't go into, and if you're not willing to have the drive to really do this every day, I talk about studio practice all the time with artists. I said, you've got to go do it, even if you just go in the studio and sit for 3 hours and you're thinking about work. Uh, that's doing something. It's when you get out of the practice of doing that without that community that's hard to simulate once you get out, that's when people really just start to move on. And, I always joke that the easiest thing to do once you get out to make sure that you keep with it is always have an opportunity or something coming up, always have a show coming up, always be submitting or sending your work off, get in the practice of doing that, get numb to the no's and be surprised and really thankful for the yeses.
Hmm.
And the longer you're in it, it becomes a lot easier. And you think it would be the opposite way around. You're like, it feels like it would just drag on you and all that kind of rejection and stuff like that. If you have it, would really start to like slow you down and make you sad about it. But that's not really the case. An art career is really what I call a long game. You're playing a long game. I always looked at it as I was going to create and be making art anyway. I might as well be showing it. If I'm comfortable commercially with where I want my work to do and where I want it to go, I should be selling it. And if I get in the spots where I need to do other things, if they're creative and they're invigorating enough for me, I'll take those things to live to fight another day. And that's it. And I have friends that teach a little bit, that workshop a little bit, that show a little bit, that residency a little bit. And they do all sorts of things and they make a life. And outside of just the creative part of making the life, the other thing that makes it really worthwhile is the people you meet along the way. And it's funny that the art world is a really big world, but when you're in it long enough, it becomes small really quick. And you talk to somebody and so is connected to somebody and you met this person here because you're on a show together. And I can't tell you, there are 3 or 4 artists that I've been in shows with that I've never met in person that we've helped each other transport work just because there's a mutuality and respecting, like, yeah, we were in that show together 3 years ago. Well, look, I've got a painting that's coming through here or a sculpture, and I know somebody in Middle Tennessee. Are you going to be around to pick that up or we can get it here? And we've done that. And that's a kind of a beautiful thing about, uh, once you try to simulate that community, when you're in it long enough, that community starts to happen if you're working. And the longer you're around that, people take you more serious and your opportunities and chances come and you just maximize them as you go through it and enjoy it. Like I said, the if you're going to be making any way, you're going to be okay. And the people that are in the long game that have been around that are really there in charge, usually most of the time, they're the right people to be doing that and they're great. And you'll find that it starts to take care of itself and it becomes easier. It really does.
Excellent. Oh, most of my students find that encouraging. I know I definitely took a sort of a studio tech role to fulfill both graduate school stuff and also to make some money outside of grad school. So yeah, that's good. That's really good.
Yeah. And I think one thing too is be curious. I know exactly what I want to do and what I want to make if I have like my perfect kind of time. But there have been things that I thought I didn't want to do or be around and that I just took a chance because either I had the time to do it or I needed to do it. And those things have led to other things and they've been life changing. And I would just say too, be smart about what you're doing, but be curious and investigate and try because you never know what's going to be the little seed or what's going to be the connection to the person you meet that transforms where your path is going to go. So
Absolutely. Yeah, be open-minded to what could and could not happen. Yeah.
definitely, sure.
Well, I'm going to open the floor to you. Is there anything else that you want to talk about with your work or as a student or as a professor or anything in between?
Well, I would say you guys are primarily totally an undergraduate program, right?
We have some STEM graduate courses, but for art, it's all undergrad.
Yeah. And you have some students coming from your program that will try to be going to a graduate program, I guess.
I believe so, yes.
I would talk about this with like, you know, I just got through the dinner with my student group. This is really funny. So I'm the faculty advisor for a student group, and we have 136 student organizations at our school. And with those organizations, there's all kinds of structure in our campus. And University of Tennessee Martin is really great with supporting student groups, student organizations, and we do all sorts of stuff during the year to basically compete for scholarships, to compete for travel funds. Anyway, we are now back to back student organizations of the year. So out of 136, 2 years in a row, an art group has won student organization of the year. So I'm super proud. But every year at the beginning, I tell my kids, I'm like, well, if you guys get student organization of the year, I will take you all out to dinner. And tonight, there's 8 of my officers, and we have about 30 or 40 members in the group. But the officer teams are the people that organize and take care and run the whole kind of shebang the year long. Tonight was the night I took them all out to dinner and paid for it. And so anyway, I'm a little lighter in the pocket, but totally well worth it. But one of the things we talked about was, I had 3 or 4 kids that were getting ready to like look at grad school seriously. And we were talking about building a good body of work in your last 2 years to be able to do that. And then how do you start to build up your show resume? And there are 2 things that I think are really important that a young artist should think about. And I think when I was down, I think James, we talked about this a little bit because we shared a lot of like teaching strategies and war stories. And one thing is, as a young artist, is you don't have to have 20 good ideas and one example of each of those ideas. You really, right now, to build a body of work, you need one really good idea and you need 20 examples of it. I'm a firm believer in that. And the reason why I put a number on it is because that's about how many pieces you need to do a solid show at most places. But also, too, the more pieces that you have at your reserve, the more things and places you can submit your work to and have it available. So if you've got more examples of what you do best, of your best idea, when opportunity comes, if you put, let's say, if you're an artist that has 5 pieces and they're good, right? And you get 2 in a show here and you get 2 others in a show here, and really you're out of work, well, those shows are going to be up for 2 months. So every other opportunity that comes up, then you're just stuck. So, for like, it takes a month usually to process a show. So for 3 months, you're going to get 2 lines. Now, if you have 20, think about the possibilities then. If the work is good, you can be sending it to all sorts of places, because the last place you want work sitting is in your studio, closed behind a door, not doing anything for you. So, you have to work as hard after you make the work of getting it out there, getting it seen, getting a dialogue. That's part of developing it too, is every time you have a piece in a show and you go to the show where you have a conversation about it, you're going to get feedback about the show. Exhibition spaces and galleries and college universities, they're like the science lab of the art world. And you really learn a lot about your work when it's up. And sometimes it's big, long conversations, and sometimes it's little short snippets. Uh, I think the other part of that is when you're getting this work out there and you're doing that is, really looking at what you're wanting to say now with where your work is at and where you see it going next. Always have one foot in the now and then be looking down the road. And I think, when you're applying to schools and looking at that those are the things that you want to be thinking about and making sure that you're building that up as you're going. Uh, I don't know. That was a conversation we had tonight.
It did,
And
yeah.
something about TikTok. I'm not a TikTok, but there was lots of funny back to school TikTok things that they were looking at. So
Some of them are pretty dark humor. I've seen a few of them
it's a lot
myself.
of dark humor, yeah. And some of it, it's just totally like I don't understand the importance of it, but they seem to have a good time. So I'm fine with that.
My main professor back in undergrad would say theme and variation, so he would definitely build off the same idea, yeah, both with TikTok and with art.
I'm telling you that seems to really be it. The other thing I would say is I think kids or students are really good at doing this, maybe not always in the right way. And I would say this is one thing that I notice. And, I'm kind of, the longer you're in this, you kind of graduate to different positions, right? Usually when you're in grad school or undergraduate and you're moving up, you're in this place of kind of like the young person that's hungry, and you're trying to get your work out there. You're trying to get people to take you seriously, and you're trying to have enough of it out there to start working for you. And then eventually what happens is, if you're good enough and you're doing that long enough, like, you'll start to have to work less for the opportunities, and people will know you and they'll start to offer them. And that's really good. And then when that comes up, then you start getting asked to come jury the shows or come do this or put something together or speak here. And then you become, all of a sudden, you notice you've graduate up to where you're on the other end of this. I always kind of approach this as still like that hungry 24-year-old. I'm fresh out of grad school, kind of like the world's against me, but I want to show everybody. For me, that mentality is really great. But I noticed that I'm more on the back end of some of this stuff now. And, social media and stuff like that, it is so easy to get your work out there and to be seen and to get it public. But I think the avenue of like how people do it sometimes is really kind of counterproductive. Like, showing a bad image of a good piece is, you might as well not even post it. Also, too, if you're telling people that you're an artist, and unless this is your work, unless you're some kind of conceptual performance artist, uh, if you're posting 15 selfies a day or a week in comparison to the ratio of your artwork, I have a hard time just on my end, like, waiting, like, well, when's the art going to come and sticking around? Whereas a lot of artists that I know that, when they're hitting me with good images, and the images of the artwork is taken well and it's framed nice and it's put up in the picture, I'm blown away. There is some amazing, and this is the great thing about it, access to seeing more artwork than we ever had. And I'm amazed by how many young artists there are out there that are doing exciting things in painting, uh, mixed media sculpture, kind of installation, short video. I mean, it's unbelievable. There are so many young artists that are just as good as most of the mid-career or older artists that are out there. And I think there are probably some other people that aren't getting seen because they're just not delivering what they do creatively in the right way, or it's getting lost in the message of too much me, 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 and not the work. If you're great, that's awesome. And everybody will find out how great you are. But really, it starts with the work. It really starts with what you're doing. So, yeah, I guess I don't know how we started on that, but I think
Yeah,
that's important.
what's the idea of TikTok? Is a large part of what I've seen on
Oh yeah,
TikTok.
there we go.
Yeah, is you have ceramicists doing certain things and they're recording themselves doing it, and you have sculptors doing certain things. And some of the stuff we do is, very loud and fires everywhere and things are going and things are happening. And so you're right, a lot of the process, a lot of the products that we see on TikTok and Instagram, and even Facebook still, that really does promote the work and the artist when they use it that way.
Yeah, I tell you what, you brought up process, and it's funny because you know the last thing I want anybody to ever see me, just how I work, because I'm very very private about this experience, is me painting a picture. But I've noticed there is quite the audience for watching people do the process of making, kind of revealing the magic behind the thing.
Mhm.
I can't tell you how many people have been amazed by like what I would consider would end up being very bad paintings, but they watch them being made because they love the revelation of the process. And so if you're an artist that's able to engage in a process and be engaging when you do it, I would say, that's almost as important as some of the good pictures, that the process is really a good selling point. I just don't think all the time too much personal stuff unless it's part of your work, or bad images of what you made.
Mm.
Because the only thing I see, especially the bad images thing, is a big thing. Is I just notice how bad the image is of the work, and automatically I just get dismissive because, like anybody else now, we see thousands of images every day. And if you're an artist and you're looking at that, I mean, you see so much artwork. And what you're really looking for is something that's kind of unique, that stands out, that doesn't have to be totally figured out, but that's on its way or engaging or interesting in its own way, but that feels professional and considered. And so I would say, be thinking about that, because that never goes away. That's something that's consistently there all the time.
Absolutely. Biggest thing I've seen is just clutter. Like when you have a bad framing of your work, you're paying more attention to why is it off center? Why is this stuff in the background? Why is this dirty? So I'm not even looking at the artwork. I'm looking at everything but.
Yeah, or like, if it's my favorite one, and I'm gonna know I have students, I have friends that have done this too, and I'm just like, what you doing? Is a picture of a really great piece of art in the distance of a room, and you're just looking and picking the room apart. And you've forgotten that you're looking at this image because there was a piece of artwork there that a friend wanted you to see, or a student. And so I think you have to eliminate some of that other stuff because, people's attention spans, we just flock around. There's so much stuff out there. So, I mean, even I consider myself a very considered looker. I'll get off topic looking at something visually if there's like, "Whoa, look at that old antique trim. Why do they have that in their apartment?" I'll just move right off the thing. Or, "Oh, why do they have a Blink 182 poster? How, I mean, that seems like, really? Like, you got a poster and you're in your 30?" I'm like a Larry David episode sometimes, just
Hmm.
picking apart people's rooms, but I'm supposed to be there to look at their artwork. And so, but I think the process stuff is cool, and I think, uh, this generation definitely does have an advantage of having all this media at their exposure, but just, using it, I think, with a super professional, I want to call it like an older kind of like stance of like thinking about everything as professional when you're out there, but just understand everything you put out there is like being considered. And so, what do you really want considered? Do you want me like making jokes to myself about your Blink 182 picture? Do you want me to talk about the merits of your sculpture? And so, like, whatever you include in your image, that's going to happen. So,
Absolutely. Especially when your target audience are visually interested in what you're showing them anyways. And so, yeah.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's what we want. That's where it starts. I mean, one of the coolest things that I had happen, I talked with you a little bit when I was there about collecting, and the odd thing was I didn't talk about like some of the art that I've ended up collecting from like newer artists, and I remember seeing a really great image that a friend posted from a group show that he put together, and it was this painting by this young lady, Brianna Bass, and you know, fast forward 3 years later, and I'm seeing it again. I'm like, I remember that painting. I love that painting, but this was her newer work, and she's at Yale now, finishing an MFA in painting. She was a painter in Chattanooga, was running an alternative space, but we'd got some work of hers right before. But I mean, for me, when she started to sell some work to be able to go there, it stuck with me and it was instantly as good because her one image that I saw the first time, which was shot beautifully, was right. Of course, she's a really good painter, so it makes it easy. But I mean, instantly I connected with it twice. And for me, that was the thing that made me kind of, easily jump into and be like, we need to get a couple of these, which we
Mm.
did. So um, I think that stuff, it has a longer resonance than me thinking about, oh yeah, you're the artist that had, that Blink 182 poster. So I don't want to keep using that example. If you like Blink 182, great. I understand we've been talking about how powerful nostalgia is and how people will defend things to the end of the world if it's part of their nostalgia, whether it's good or bad. We have that too, I guess. I mean, I'm trying to think of something that I'm nostalgic about that's not very good that I defend. I'm sure there's plenty of things, plenty of black. Okay, Happy Gilmore would be one.
Yep.
Adam Sandler movies are generally not that good. We're not watching Citizen Kane,
Right.
but I saw Happy Gilmore at a theater with my friends, and we were all idiots at that age, and we laughed really hard, and I defend it.
Mhm.
So there you go. That's my bad. That's one of my bad things that I'll defend. So
Well,
just because it's part of my nostalgia.
it's point of context too. It hits you right when you needed to be hit. You were the target audience, and you found it funny, so it works.
I was, I was the idiot that would laugh at the stuff in that movie. Although I think there's parts of that movie that are kind of timeless and a very slapsticky kind of like Three Stooges kind of way. And that's how I look at it. I don't sit there and like take apart the story structure, but maybe it's not fair that I do that to Blink 182. I don't know. So nostalgia is very important.
Yeah. They're still known if that counts for anything.
I mean, sure they are. I'm telling you, like, the kids I have defend that. What's the other band? I don't know. There was one that came here and played our festival one year, and I had no idea who they were, and the kids were really defending them. And another one is I never got it when it came out, was Fall Out Boy, and a lot of these kids grew up. They were like Fall Out Boy was their junior high band,
Mhm.
and they're like, "Look, I know it's not good, but I'm telling you, don't talk about Fall Out Boy." And I have to admit, I admire their defense of their teenage nostalgia. I get it. So yeah.
Yeah,
You know, watch me,
absolutely.
James. I'll go down this road and talk about pop culture stuff all day. So
No, I'm just gonna let you. I was gonna ask you to for that
yeah.
matter, because like I think students need to know that like we're not some austere tie only kind of people. Like we're real people. We have weird interests and we have weird conversations, and it's
Well,
cool.
I would say this would be important then. Okay, so here's a point that I'll take out of that I would say maybe to young artists that's really more of a serious kind of point on all this. And I would say take value and pride in whatever your craft or your field is. If you're a sculptor, if you're a ceramic artist, if you're installation, if you're video, if you're a painter drawer, like take pride in like being a historian of your trade. I think being a historian of your trade, one, leads to your craft. It leads to a consideration of every time when you sit down, understanding you're having a dialogue. When I sit down and painting, there's at least one time in every body of work that I'm aware that I'm having a dialogue that dates back to, people in the dark doing dot paintings in a cave because they're experiencing sensory deprivation, which is really what those paintings were.
Yeah.
It starts from there and it leads up to what I'm doing. And, I always, Carol Dunham, who's a painter that I like, had this great thing to say about painting. And he said that the thing that he liked about painting were all the things that, people said that was wrong with painting, is that it's so limited, it's so historical, it's so square in some sense, and that you're basically dealing with the same tools that people 600 years dealt with. And how do you continue that conversation and how do you make it new? And I think a problem with students coming out of school now is that they're not very good historians. It's a generational thing, and I think it's something that's really easy to be fixed. I remember when I started art school and I was 18. If you didn't know about certain artists that were older, and when you were hanging out with the older artists in the program, they would laugh you out of the room. You would not be invited back to hang out in like the cigarette circle or the hat, whatever people were talking when they were getting out of a drawing class. You were not invited back. How could you not know that painter? How could you know? I remember one time I didn't know who R.B. Cottage was. And to be fair, I was 18 and I actually knew a lot about art then because I just killed all the books that were at our local library and went through every one of them like a madman. But we did not have a Cottage book. I did not know who Cottage was. And I got laughed out, but I made it my mission that next week to find every Cottage book at Murray State University, which was where I was at the time, and find out everything I could about him so that the next time I crept up on the circle, like, hey, I looked at that. And I think the danger of not being a historian is you do your craft a little disservice because you're not addressing all the possibilities. And the other thing too is when you have a breakthrough, you might be having somebody else's breakthrough that happened 50 years ago. And if you get stuck, eventually someone is going to come up and say, have you looked at this artist? Which is like the one thing you don't want to hear at an opening. Everything we do has been influenced or touched on or spoken on. It's kind of the Nietzsche thing. There's no original text.
Right.
Of course, we're part of a larger, longer conversation that started somewhere and we didn't start it. We're continuing it. So influence is fine. And that's not what I'm talking about. But watching somebody really think that they have a breakthrough when they just haven't seen something that was made 40 years ago, and you have to tell them that happened. It's part of my job, but it's also like, how are you not looking or knowing about this stuff yet? And I think being a historian of your field is important. And that means knowing more than 10 years of what you're looking at,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I could talk about the fluffiness of a Fragonard and just, just woo and wow over it, just like I would, like John Wesley or Carol Dunham or Chris O'Feely or Michael Ray Charles, like any of those guys, I mean, to me, it's just as important.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I do think there is room for reiterations of things in the past. So it's still
Sure.
viable. Absolutely. Yeah. But
Yeah, just don't think, I think like knowing like, okay, this person did this. I'm going to take this from right here and I'm going to make it new by either recontextualizing it or changing one thing. Starting that dialogue there, when you talk to somebody that's informed, that's fine. Being completely oblivious and thinking that you just found, the moon that's not fine.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. I was thinking, I was listening recently to a podcast when Duchamp put the mustache on his version of the Mona Lisa. It almost reinvigorized the original painting anyways. In a way, it's literally keeping the heartbeat alive of all these contemporary stuff that's from 600, 800, 900 years ago.
Are you talking about the Elisha Q?
Yes.
That one? Yeah.
Which apparently translates as in she has a hot ass.
She has hot pants.
Yeah.
And no, like, here's the funny thing is every art historian and every class, like that's one of the best. If you had to have art history's greatest hits, everybody that had that moment in an art history class where they saw that for the first time and got the play on words was floored, right? You remember it, like you get juiced up, like, oh, I remember for me, that was the validating point of Duchamp.
Yes.
That cleverness. And in my, like, I'll relate this back to the show. In my show, there are the part of the title is there are some like play on words. There are lots of parts in the painting that if you read the picture, a literal reading of the picture is what the picture is about.
Mhm.
If you will spend time and like say, there's a pencil, da, 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 and you go through it, it will spell out exactly what the painting is.
Mhm.
So I think language and playing with language too, and like it's a great example that you bring up. Uh, that's an exciting way to go, especially because there's so much new language that's happening, like new terminology. Sometimes I don't quite understand it, but I've got to admit I'm like super curious about it, like how um, I don't know. There's different sayings now that just seem like they would be easier if you just said the literal thing,
Yep.
because the new translation of how to say it seems so far removed from what you're actually saying. But there's an energy behind the revitalization of anything. And I think right now, more than anywhere, it's happening in language, which
Mhm.
then, of course, translates to text.
Yep.
And that there's an immense amount of like room to explore that as an artist and convert that into something visual. So, there's Duchamp's newest legacy. I think people could play around with that all day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My favorite talking about the idea of new slang is the words "say less." The first time my student said that to me, I was like, "Excuse me," because I was like, "Are you trying to be rude?" Because it's a derivation from "say no more." It means like, "I got you, I understand where you're at." But the way you say it, the energy of that is like you've said too much. It's like you're not in a position to be able to say that. But going back to like an earlier comment
Yeah,
you said,
that's exactly what I'm talking about. So yes, yeah,
going back to an earlier point you said about the emojis, like they're modern day hieroglyphs. That's iconography for paintings, and so it
sure.
becomes a little bit difficult to read it when it's the Renaissance because we're not familiar with that visual language that they would have understood. So yeah, I appreciate the fact that your pieces have this iconography that is up to date, if you will, and that's one of the biggest reasons I think, as you're to your point too, like using stuff like the Mona Lisa, using these older ideas, is that we have this new slang, we have this new way of seeing this new verbal language. It's like updating some of the older ideas into a contemporary way. This is a good way to go. It's also a good way to know your history because now you're forced to look back at the past and see what has been done. What can I add to? What can I take away from, for that matter?
Well, sure, and I think everything right now is uh, art. I mean, you have to have two things to keep any kind of art form alive, right? You have to have a block of people that are really what I would call the true avant-garde, which means they are always trying to make something new, even if it's a disaster.
Mm,
And they will go through a multitude of disasters, but ultimately hit on something new because eventually you have to have some kind of new original content that can start that process of re-examining and
mm,
recontextualizing and revisiting it. But there's also a lot of artists, and this is how most art works now. And think about music and sampling and movies
mm,
and books, and how like postmodernism is almost completely self-referential all the time.
yep,
Is the fact that we're aware of constantly, and this is part of all art, I think, right now in any kind of form of media, that everything has happened in some kind of context before. So the way in which you make references to something, all of that carries a certain weight, and it's a validator. And so when you're making something, you're showing an influence now, I think you're saying, if you're aware of what you're doing, that I am channeling this and I'm being really direct about it because I want to appropriate this for a second to get you in this frame of mind.
mhm,
And what I want you to notice is what's different about what I'm doing because that's what I'm actually saying once you're in this state of mind.
mm,
But if you're not aware of it, it's just freaking chance.
yep,
And you can't, I mean, you can win at dominoes occasionally if you don't know what you're doing, but I mean, you're not going to win much. But I mean, think about music. I mean, I, I remember the first time I loved when I was in the 80s. I loved when hip hop came around because it was so different, and I loved early rap. And I can't believe how many songs that I heard sampled in 80s hip hop and rap music that later, when I was in my mid 20s, found out were parts of soul music that
mm,
I ended up liking when I was earlier. Like the Isley Brothers, how many Isley Brothers were sampled into other songs? And so I've been hearing the Isley Brothers song, and I'm like, that was in, Today was a good day by Q. That's just wow. And it would blow your mind when you would find the song that you loved, you first experienced it as a sample
Hmm,
in something else already cut up. You didn't find the block of cheese, you found the slice.
absolutely.
And so knowing that slice came from a block is kind of mind blowing, but it's also really rewarding if it's done in the right way. So,
Absolutely. I actually have a professional question for you on that one
okay.
too. So we have a photographer that got in trouble for this for the Obama thing, where he translated into a two-dimensional image from a photograph that didn't belong to him. So how far with sampling, especially with visual language, how far removed do you have to have it have it be before it becomes not plagiarism?
Well, I think the cases to look at on that would definitely be, I mean, there's definite art historical cases that we can point to. And, one would be, uh, you could start as early as, I'm sure there were some that happened before this, but, one that I thought of early on was Warhol's Wallflowers.
Yep.
That guy sued him over that.
Mm.
Then you can go to a lot of the Jeff Koons stuff. Jeff Koons has been to court several times. And of course, Richard Prince,
Yeah.
who is like directly just takes that. And their work is kind of talking about what is the sanctity of originality.
Mm.
And that's where their discussion talks about. Now, it's up to us, kind of as viewers, not to say that it's not art, but talk about how valid or not valid that discussion is, or if that's a good or bad discussion or the commentary. I'm not huge fans of any of those artists, but I appreciate works that they did. It was really kind of weird that I liked Warhol's Wallflowers. I'm like, that's a really smart move. I bet and then like he didn't even take the picture, which is fine because a lot of the pictures he was cropping or getting from other places. And that's kind of his old dialogue, is that he was taking from pop culture and he was representing pop culture. I think the Richard Prince thing, the first time, this is a really great story. I was in San Antonio, and one of the best people to me as a graduate student at the time was an artist named Chuck Ramirez. And Chuck Ramirez was probably, if not the one of the biggest contemporary artists in San Antonio at the time. Chuck's passed on now, but he was a photographer. He was just an amazing artist and had an amazing eye and had this bigger than life personality. And he was so big and established, he didn't have to spend any time with us, but he loved going out with the grad students. And he said, because you are exciting, you're young, you're stupid, but occasionally you're right. And and he meant that with like the most loving way. But he told me about Richard Prince, and we got in a conversation at a bar downtown, and I was insulted that somebody like Richard Prince would be doing this, and I couldn't believe it, and it blew my mind. And what blew my mind is that Chuck liked it. I'm like, how can you like this? And he just kept explaining, like, you're taking it too personal. You're not looking at what the question is. Forget the work, look at the question. And so I think with that kind of work, you really have to spend time like thinking about, well, what is the question? And sometimes, you're not wanting to think about or deal with that question at the time. 10 years from now, I might be in a place where I really have to sit down and consider Richard Prince, and I might spend a year doing it. I mean, you never know.
Mm.
I remember seeing a de Kooning at 15 and being just as mad, and then getting oil paints at 16, and then at 17, looking at that de Kooning again and being like, my God, this is a painter. I mean, it happens that quick. But I think part of it is just being investigative, being curious. Most good artists are very curious people about the world, about their materials. And so part of being a historian is being curious about what has come before. And it's a great place to mine, especially when you're stuck. It's just looking and reading and observing and finding commonality. Um, I like a lot of early American modernism and a lot of European modernism around this period. Part of it is I feel very connected to, like, I think the time frames are very similar with what's happening right now and what was happening then. And I can see a lot more meaning in this day and age now, looking at the work with how I think about it than when I first fell in love with it. And it was purely just a visual kind of love affair with it.
Absolutely.
And that's because the context of what was happening in the world then, and where they were working. And, for me, American society now and what we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of history recycling itself, my professor said it better. It's like if you're productively an artist, you're on a spiral. So you come back around, but you're at a higher platform than what you were. So I think as an artist, in an art,
Oh, that's really good. Who said that? That's so good.
Sarah Schneckloff. She is in USC in South Carolina, Columbia. Yeah, she's brilliant. She's one of the most intelligent people I've ever met in my life.
Yeah,
I won't brag on her
that's
enough.
freaking
Yeah.
genius. That's great right there. I like that you end up higher if you keep going up. That's
Yeah.
that feels promising. So
Well, the problem is the opposite is true too. Now you're going upwards. If you stop, you come back down kind of quick.
yeah, don't stop, right? Yeah, that's
But like even from an art historical perspective, that's the same thing that's happening, right? Because we're in a time of like, I'm going to call it an uncertain wartime because like we just basically got out of a war. Are we going to get into another one? We just got out of depression. COVID is rampant right now. What's going to happen with that? What's the political fallout? What's the financial fallout? Yeah, absolutely. Like we're in a very weird time. So one of my students was comparing it to the Great Gatsby not that long ago, like just the time era that we're in.
it's very funny. I think American culture borders on that and kind of like being this weird, like it's almost neo baroque and a little rococo with the excessiveness. And what it points out is it really starts to illustrate and show the class divide.
Mm,
That there's not really a middle class.
mm,
I think in a weird way there is what I would call a social middle class. And when I mean social, like social media middle class, that's kind of like the leveling, but it's not like a financial middle class.
right.
And so you see really absurd, kind of like desperate things that people will share on social media that are, very, very, very like people in just in bad situations. And that's what they've alluded that somehow becomes comedy,
Mm,
somehow becomes something that's shared. And then, you see like, I watched a TikTok video today and it's like, you know, somebody was talking about, a person in a room dressed up with like all their clothes was walking through and like talking about every brand that they were wearing for like 20 minutes. And like people were like, like this is funny too. And like to me, that's very like excessive, kind of, I don't know, very rogue. I mean, just and it's very different. It's very divided. And it's very, very those two worlds are very far apart,
mm.
but it's in the same world. And so it just makes me think of social class a lot when I see that. So
Baroque with Wi-Fi.
huh?
Baroque with Wi-Fi.
Yeah, yeah. And what we kind of like and what you don't like, I think that is really the presence. I say it's a social media middle class, but like people are averaging that out by validation.
Mm, yeah.
And so I think that's where the presence of the middle class comes in is like this weird kind of like what's valid and what's not. Of course, that's changing based on like social milieu and other things, but that's really fascinating. It's an invisible kind of like ghost conscious of a middle class that I don't feel like is physically present anymore.
Right.
And so if you spend a lot of time in there, I mean, I don't know. It's a online's a is a funny world. It's kind of fun for me to put my toes in, but I pull it back out. So
Yeah. Well, it's
yeah.
scary too because there is a bit of an algorithm, so you tend to find what you're looking for and nothing else, and so it's easy to get kind of trapped in there.
Yeah, yeah. And you could I was talking with somebody about the algorithms that they found in some of the Q stuff, which for me, I'm not trying to get too political in this discussion, but for me, the idea that you can use catchphrases and certain slogans and sayings to pull a response outside of what it's connected to, which
Mm,
I'm going to stay away from, but just as an artist, knowing that there is that kind of direct control messaging, which I don't know how tight it is to like, past like methods of propaganda and stuff like that. But the fact that like you can turn the way somebody thinks that quick
yep.
by using trigger words and like phrases, and that meaning is extracted from somebody within if you just use those words and they're instantly on board.
Yep.
Uh, it's fascinating as an artist, but it's also scary as hell.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Talk about this stuff all day. It's just,
We're also redefining the role of an artist, right? We can have comedy, we can have political agendas, we can have our own biases we're working through or biases we're hiding from. Like the kind of the goal of an artist is to observe and ask questions and make very pointed statements at times like this.
and I think comedy is a great thing. I as a kid I loved comedy, and I don't know if I told you the story about getting like you'd have this mail-in thing that was called like you'd get from Columbia Records or somewhere, and you could for $10 you would get 5 cassettes a month. And we were part of this program once my mom had kind of like started dating my stepfather, and we had money to do it because we were very poor, kind of starting out. And every other month, I got to pick one. You get to pick one and put it on the list, and like my mom picked the rest. They were always, bless her, they was terrible. I always joked that my mom had the worst taste in music. Like you see those commercials for like sounds of nature, like the babbling brook, mountain spray. Like who would listen to that for hours? My mom would on every road trip. So anyway, uh, but one of the things I loved is that you could get comedy tapes. And I remember getting Eddie Murphy Raw
Mm,
and it came in, and I guess they weren't paying attention because they didn't listen to it before I got it, and like listening to it for weeks and loving Eddie Murphy and like having one that was a Richard Pryor one and loving Richard Pryor. And in grad school, you know what's got us through like post 9/11 grad school is everybody would come to my apartment on, I can't remember if it was Tuesday, Thursday night, and we would get together and eat popcorn and watch the Chappelle show when Chappelle was out. And for us, like Dave Chappelle was like, I mean, that show was everything. And so, I mean, for me, comedy has always been an important part of like, you know, when you're kind of making social critiques and social decisions, is finding out where that line is. Cause comedy is really, maybe not so much now, but it was always kind of like the barometer, the litmus test of for where what was acceptable and what wasn't, and like how that line is moved back and forth, you know, left and right. So,
I've had a good friend call all comedians are more or less modern day philosophers. They're the ones that stand up and punch the
true. Yeah.
yeah, like
Yeah. And
there's
Chappelle's great. I mean, Chappelle's last special that he did, the, I'm trying to remember, it was a certain time limit. I don't remember the time limit. I should, but I mean, it was part comedy, but it was just a real kind of speech, direct message about thinking about that amount of time and what happened. Uh, I don't know. I mean, it was just, I bet I watched it 20 times in a row. I was painting and it came out, and somebody said, "Have you seen this yet?" This was, I guess, a couple months after the George Floyd thing. And I can't tell you how many times I just played it in a row just listening to it because, you know, so much of the detail in which what Chappelle focused on was really made you stop and consider things that you just take for granted when you say a time amount,
right.
and like what he's talking about, like what's really happening, what someone's going through, and like what somebody's going through physically when this is happening under those conditions. And I don't know, he's just a genius in my mind. So
Absolutely. He's actually the point that he's why I made that comment because like he has been he's very, very good about staying on the comedic side but making very pointed statements. He's
yeah,
been extremely good at that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, he's amazing.
Well, cool. Well, I'm going to end the interview now, but thank you so much for
Okay.
joining us. And I really appreciate you bringing your work too. And it was like a 4 hour drive west, and we got to get back to you. It's like all this is a disaster for scheduling, and school's starting back, and COVID. I just really appreciate you being patient with us and for you showing their work. So, looking
No, it's
forward.
been great. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being such a great host.
We're looking forward to talking to you with students tomorrow, and so that'll be hopefully like what 24 less 20 hours from now, something like that. So. I will say adieu, and I'll end the interview here.
Okay, sounds great. See you, James.
See ya.